All right, so let's take another look at our top story of the deepening SA-USA tensions. With the G20 summit being hosted in South Africa this year, can South Africa use the presidency to smooth over the relationship? Let's talk through the possibilities now with researcher Dr. Laurence Caromba from the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Doctor, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. What does South Africa's presidency of the G20 mean for its role on the global stage, and how can it leverage its position to address this now strained relationship with the USA?
Yeah, so I mean, the G20 is this international forum essentially that is designed to facilitate, international cooperation, mostly on economic issues. So it's quite a prestigious thing for South Africa to be able to host. It's not necessarily it's already a position that comes with power per se, apart from really, like agenda setting power, like the power to set the discussion. But it is an important thing. But it seems like it is now coinciding with this growing rift between South Africa and the United States. And in fact, the G20 is possibly becoming a bit of a casualty of that. So we see that the US Secretary of State Margot Rubio will not be attending the G20 Foreign Ministers Summit. It's a difficult problem for the South African government to solve. It depends on what we assume Trump's goals are and what he's trying to achieve, and how we understand his strategy essentially and how we want to respond.
Right. I mean, a lot has happened in just 1 week. So, I mean, the road to November could be quite a lengthy one, and so much can happen between now and then. Are there any particular global issues that you think South Africa should prioritize at the G20 that could resonate with the US and also just try and help these strained relations between the two countries?
Well, I mean, we can't really be changing the agenda because the agenda's already been set, and we know that the issues that South Africa has already placed on the agenda, topics like climate change, are not issues that are seen as desirable by the current US administration. So I kind of feel like that ship has sailed to some degree. But there might be scope for personal diplomacy, maybe at the head of state level. Obviously, President Cyril Ramaphosa has already tried this at a different level, but there may be some scope to smooth things over. And like I said, it also depends on how we understand the US government and what it's trying to achieve. Do we understand Trump and his administration to be essentially a rational actor that is trying to sort of bargain with South Africa and change South African policy in some way? Is Trump signaling to his own domestic audiences? Is he just like outsourcing decision-making to other people in his administration? How we choose to understand and model what the US is doing will influence, how South Africa wants to respond to try to preserve, whatever benefits we get from this relationship.
So, Doctor, with that said, I mean, from your own analysis in terms of how President Trump is shaping his administration and to what audience he is playing to, are there any low-hanging fruits that South Africa can reach out to in terms of mending these relationships in accordance to how they want to structure a way forward for their country and also just those foreign relations that they have with other countries?
Yeah, possibly. So, I mean, if we assume, if we choose to treat Trump as essentially like a rational actor who's trying to achieve some sort of goal, right? But there's different goals that he might be trying to achieve. So if his goal is actually to try to force South Africa to change its own policy, right? Like we know that he dislikes things like the Expropriation Act. Then his foreign policy strategy has some weird elements. Like he's saying that the US is going to take away, aid from South Africa. But it kind of seems like US foreign aid largely seems to be going away to all countries, right? So it's not a very effective method of coercion to say that, like do what we want you to do, or we're going to take away this thing that we were probably going to take away already, right? There's an inconsistency there, and it's not quite sure how South Africa could really rationally respond to that. But then the other side is that if we assume that Trump's goal is to kind of signal that he signaled to domestic audiences that kind of he's strong and aggressive and can get sort of foreign policy wins over other countries, then there might be some scope to give Trump a kind of a, like small symbolic concessions that don't really matter to South Africa, but allow the US to allow the US administration to portray it as having a victory. I think this is the approach that we've seen used by countries like Canada and Mexico to kind of stave off, trade tariffs and embargoes, where they sort of like give Trump a symbolic win, So how we understand U.S. goals sort of depends on that kind of influences which of these two approaches we would go with in terms of like whether to make symbolic concessions or to hold firm.
I mean, lastly, Doc, let's just maybe speak on just the relationship between the U.S. and South Africa, and just the broader context of global geopolitics, especially with the rising powers and what seemingly is the shifting alliances between these two countries. Where do you see ourselves in the next year or two, especially with BRICS in play, with, again, South Africa's support for Palestine and the ICJ? Where would you place us in that broader context?
Absolutely, and when we look at the G20, I mean, in some ways, the G20 lies right at the heart of all of this, because this is an organization that brings together those BRICS countries as well as the G7 and the traditional Western powers, and kind of puts them all together in a single forum. And so this is where we kind of want to resolve those differences, and so. If we can't even get all these different countries in the same room together, it makes that a lot harder. But in terms of how we see the relationship between South Africa and the US evolving, I mean, I think it's obvious that the Trump administration has created a new international environment that is quite difficult for South Africa and difficult for a lot of other countries. Even traditional US allies have had a hard time with trying to, deal with Trump and his various demands to do all sorts of things. But the thing is, though, that part of the problem in this particular case is that when we look at US aid to South Africa, it primarily consists of foreign healthcare spending. Something like 90%, I think, is related to HIV/AIDS. And in some ways, we are also the victim of this broader pullback of the US from this area across the world. We're seeing the US withdrawing from things like the World Health Organization. It's pulling back from vaccine initiatives all around the world. I think it's unfortunate. It is harmful to South African interests. It will ultimately lead to people's deaths. And it's unfortunate also for US foreign policy interests. Really, this is one area where all the countries of the world really have a shared interest in trying to prevent future disease pandemics from breaking out. And I think it's unfortunate that the US has chosen to follow this approach on this particular issue, at least.
Right. Okay, Dr. Laurence Caromba, thank you so much for your time this evening.